In the late summer of 2013, the hills of Northern California were dry and golden, their quiet warmth beginning to fade into the subtle coolness that marked the end of August. College towns, just weeks into a new semester, hummed with the ordinary rhythms of young people adjusting to a fresh start, moving into apartments, settling into routines, and beginning again. Among them was a 19-year-old named Bryce Laspisa, a sophomore at Sierra College, living in the small town of Rockland, not far from Sacramento. Bryce had grown up in Illinois, raised by Karen and Michael Laspisa, a close-knit couple who described their son as thoughtful, artistic, and easy to be around. In high school, he'd shown a creative eye, particularly in graphic and industrial design, and after graduation, the family relocated to Laguna Niguel in Southern California, drawn by the sun, opportunity, and the chance to be closer to Bryce's chosen college. From the outside, their life appeared steady. No obvious fractures, no signs of a child slipping away from his path. Bryce was their only son, and they had moved together as a unit. At Sierra College, Bryce lived off campus in an apartment he shared with a roommate. He had friends, a girlfriend, and a course of study he was invested in. Those who knew him described him as social but not wild, intelligent without being arrogant. He drank socially, played video games, and kept in regular contact with his parents, calling home often, texting updates, asking for advice in small, everyday ways. There was nothing to suggest that the summer of 2013 would mark the end of that rhythm. But sometimes the shift in a person's behavior doesn't come with warning. Sometimes it unfolds so gradually that only in hindsight does it take shape, each small moment becoming part of a larger pattern that only makes sense after everything has already changed. In the days leading up to his disappearance, Bryce's behavior had begun to shift in ways that unsettled those closest to him. He had given away personal belongings, a pair of diamond earrings, his Xbox, to friends with little explanation. He had started drinking more heavily, even alone, and had taken prescription medication that wasn't his, claiming it helped him stay awake. His roommate noticed he had been staying up all night and sleeping through the day. His girlfriend, who had known him for some time, said he seemed distant, withdrawn, not quite himself. These changes weren't dramatic in isolation, but together they painted a picture of someone who might have been unraveling or preparing for something he hadn't shared with anyone else. When his girlfriend expressed concern and tried to talk with him about what was going on, he ended their relationship in a brief, almost emotionless phone call. It wasn't loud or messy, it was detached. She told his mother afterward that she was worried, that something wasn't right, that Bryce had seemed like a different person. Karen and Michael, living hundreds of miles south in Laguna Niguel, had spoken to Bryce by phone during that same window of time. He had sounded off, flat, they later said. Not upset, not angry, just muted. When asked what was going on, he gave vague answers. When pushed, he told them he had a lot to talk about, but he didn't explain. And then, without prompting or warning, Bryce got into his car and began to drive. He told his parents he was coming home, but the reasons were unclear. He hadn't said whether anything had happened. He hadn't packed a bag. He hadn't told anyone at school. He just left. The drive from Rockland to Laguna Niguel should have taken about 7 hours. Bryce left on the evening of August 28th. What followed was a disjointed and confusing series of stops, delays, and conversations that lasted more than a day. He seemed aimless or possibly lost. At one point, he ran out of gas. At another, a roadside assistance worker said he was alert, polite, and calm, but had been sitting in his parked car for hours. When his parents offered to fly north and meet him, he told them no. He said he was fine. He promised he was on his way, but he never arrived. The last known contact between Bryce and his family came around 2 a.m. on August 30th, when he told his mother he was pulling off the interstate to rest. She believed him. There was no reason not to. He had said he'd be home later that day. Later that morning, his car was found. It had gone off the road near Castaic Lake, in a rugged area just north of Los Angeles. The vehicle had rolled down an embankment and come to rest on its side. Inside were Bryce's wallet, his cell phone, and his laptop. There were no signs of forced entry, no sign of struggle, no blood in or around the vehicle, no clear injuries visible on the airbags, and no Bryce. A search was launched almost immediately. Helicopters scanned the surrounding area. Dogs were brought in. Divers combed the lake. Volunteers scoured the hills and ravines near where the car had crashed. But there was no trace, no footprints, no discarded clothing, no clue as to whether Bryce had walked away under his own power or whether someone else had found him first. From that day forward, Bryce Laspisa became one of California's most baffling missing persons cases. His disappearance was not the kind marked by sudden violence, dramatic flight, or criminal suspicion. It was something quieter, a slow unspooling of behavior over days, marked by confusion, distance, and a final act that has never been fully understood. And in the years that followed, the questions remained where the answers never arrived. In the days just before Bryce vanished, the people closest to him began to notice something they couldn't quite define. It wasn't that he was suddenly a different person. It was that the familiar parts of him, the warmth, the attentiveness, the easy conversations, seemed to be slipping away without explanation. He wasn't angry. He wasn't withdrawn in any obvious way. But the clarity that had once marked his interactions was dulling, as though he were seeing the world through a filter no one else could sense. For his roommate, the changes started with the small details. Bryce began staying up through the night and sleeping during the day. He was drinking more, not in celebration or social settings, but on his own. Bottles emptied faster. His movements became harder to predict. At first, the shifts were chalked up to stress or late summer boredom. College was just beginning again, and it wasn't unusual for students to reset their rhythms during the first weeks of a new semester. But Bryce didn't reset. He drifted. There were other things, too. He gave away his belongings, things of value, things he'd had for years. His Xbox, a pair of diamond earrings he wore often. He didn't explain why. When asked, he shrugged it off. That kind of behavior didn't match the Bryce his friends knew. And though they noticed, no one yet realized how much it mattered. After all, young adults make impulsive decisions. They push boundaries, test change, experiment. But something about Bryce's shift felt less like rebellion and more like preparation. As if he were quietly closing chapters in his life without telling anyone. His girlfriend was among the first to raise a genuine alarm. They had been close, by all accounts, a stable and affectionate relationship. But in the final days of August, she sensed a growing distance between them. He was less responsive, more vague. He'd stopped sharing his thoughts the way he used to. When she pushed for conversation, trying to understand what was happening, he ended the relationship in a short phone call. There was no argument, no explanation, just a decision delivered without emotion. She was shaken by it, and even more by what followed. Unsettled, she reached out to his mother. Karen Laspisa had spoken to her son just a day earlier, and though she, too, had noticed something unusual in his tone, she hadn't been sure what it meant. Now, hearing concern echoed from someone who saw him in person every day, her sense of unease deepened. But from across the state, there was little she could do. She spoke to Bryce again briefly and asked him directly if he was okay. He said yes. He didn't want to talk about what was bothering him, only that he was fine. He told her he had a lot to talk about when he got home. He asked her to trust him. There was no dramatic break in behavior, no moment that clearly marked the transition from concern to crisis. Instead, there was a growing sense that Bryce was moving toward something quietly, intentionally, and alone. His roommate would later describe his demeanor during that week as both strange and empty. He said that Bryce wasn't acting out. He wasn't aggressive or openly emotional. He was just distant, focused on something internal, preoccupied in a way that didn't involve anyone else. In hindsight, these were the kinds of signs that seem obvious only once the outcome is known. At the time, they felt like fragments, pieces of something that might pass, or that might settle once Bryce came home and talked things through. But Bryce wasn't offering explanations. He wasn't reaching out for help. He wasn't saying anything that allowed others to intervene. And then, on the evening of August 28th, he got into his car and started driving. He told his mother he was coming home to Southern California. Laguna Niguel was nearly 450 miles from Rocklin, a long stretch of highway broken up by mountains, farmland, and the vast empty spaces between towns. The route was familiar. He had driven it before, but this time he didn't follow it straight through. That night, instead of making consistent progress south, Bryce stalled. He stopped for gas in the small town of Buttonwillow. He called roadside assistance after running out of fuel. The technician who responded said Bryce was calm and polite, sitting in his car for hours without ever explaining why he hadn't moved. The time he spent in Buttonwillow stretched on into the following day with no clear reason. He was less than 3 hours from his parents' home by then, but he didn't continue the drive. His parents grew increasingly anxious. They called him, offered to come get him. He said no, repeatedly. He told them he was just tired, that he needed to rest, that he would be home soon. He never raised his voice. He never claimed to be in danger, but he also didn't arrive. At one point, his mother spoke to him on the phone and asked him to take a break, to pull off the road and sleep for a while. He said he would. That was the last time she heard his voice. In the hours that followed, something happened, something no one has yet been able to explain. Bryce's car was found overturned early the next morning near Castaic Lake. The crash appeared to have occurred at speed, but there was no indication that another vehicle was involved. The embankment where the car had landed was steep, but not fatal. The airbags had deployed. His seatbelt was unbuckled. There was no blood inside the car, no broken glass consistent with injury. His wallet, phone, and laptop were all still there undisturbed. But he was gone. It wasn't clear whether he had walked away after the crash or been removed from the scene. There were no signs of a struggle, no visible trail. The terrain around the lake was rugged. Steep hills, dense brush, water deep enough in places to conceal a body. Search teams arrived within hours. They used helicopters, boats, sonar, sent dogs. But there was no trace. His family was notified that morning. They arrived on site within hours of the crash. Karen later said that the scene was surreal. Her son's car crumpled at the bottom of a hill, everything he'd taken with him still inside, but no sign of Bryce himself. Not a shoe, not a footprint, nothing. And so the search began, not just for a missing person, but for any understanding of what had led to this quiet, unexplained disappearance. Not a runaway, not an abduction, not a clear crisis, just a slow unraveling. A young man who, for reasons still unknown, had set out on a journey home and vanished before he arrived. In the early hours of August 30th, 2013, as the light began to shift over the hills surrounding Castaic Lake, deputies from the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department stood at the edge of a ravine. Below them was the wreckage of a car, a 2003 beige Toyota Highlander, resting on its side near the base of a steep embankment. The driver was gone, and everything else was still there. Inside the vehicle, they found a wallet, a phone, and a laptop. Bryce's ID, his cards, his backpack. Nothing had been taken. Nothing appeared to have been forcibly removed. The airbags had deployed. There was no blood in the vehicle or nearby. The seatbelt had been unlatched. And aside from some damage to the exterior, the interior of the car was largely intact. It was as if someone had driven the vehicle off the road, survived the crash, and then walked away. The officers on scene called for additional support. Given the location, the condition of the car, and the absence of the driver, the situation was immediately treated as urgent. They began to search the surrounding area, on foot, by helicopter, and with K-9 units. The lake itself, which stretched out just west of the crash site, was deep in places and surrounded by uneven, brush-covered terrain. It was a difficult place to search, but not impossible. They moved methodically, scanning the ridgelines, tracing the trails, watching for movement. Karen and Michael Laspisa were contacted by authorities that same morning. When they arrived at the scene, they were struck not only by the absence of their son, but by the stillness of the site. The car was there, but it wasn't speaking. There was no note, no clear sign of distress. The air held no clues. It was a disappearance that had taken place without any noise. Deputies began to reconstruct the timeline, trying to understand what had led to the crash. A security camera from a nearby truck stop had captured Bryce's car earlier that morning. A few hours after he had last spoken to his mother, the vehicle had been seen heading south, passing through the area near Castaic around 2:15 a.m. The distance between that location and the crash site was minimal. It suggested that the crash had happened not long after that footage was taken. There was no indication that another vehicle had been involved. No skid marks, no shattered headlights or taillights from another car. The embankment Bryce had driven over was steep, but navigable. Investigators believed the vehicle had accelerated before leaving the road. Intentionally or not, they couldn't be sure. But it was the absence of Bryce that remained most puzzling. If he had been injured, where was he? If he had walked away, why had he left everything behind? If he had needed help, why hadn't he used his phone or flagged down one of the cars that would have passed nearby in the hours before sunrise? The area surrounding the crash site was combed again and again in the days that followed. Law enforcement used scent dogs trained to track human remains. Search and rescue teams rappelled down hillsides and pushed through dense brush. Boats moved across the surface of the lake, using sonar to check the depths. Helicopters circled overhead. There were volunteers, too, locals, strangers, people who had heard about the case and wanted to help. They brought water, supplies, and a quiet determination to be part of something useful. But despite all the effort, nothing was found. Not a piece of clothing, not a shoe, not a footprint that could be clearly tied to Bryce. Every possible direction he could have walked was examined. Every structure nearby was searched. Every lead followed, but the trail stopped at the car. The possibility of suicide was considered, as it often is in cases like this. But there was no clear evidence to support it. Bryce had not spoken about harming himself. He had told his mother he was coming home. He had spoken to the roadside technician only hours before the crash, and had shown no signs of being disoriented or unstable. He had sounded tired, but not desperate. And there was no body, no note, no indication that he had ended his life. Foul play was also considered. Could someone have picked him up? Could he have been taken against his will? But the location of the crash didn't suggest a confrontation. There were no drag marks, no broken branches, no signs of a struggle. The vehicle had landed at the base of a slope, not on a major roadway. If someone had intercepted him, they had done so without leaving any trace. Family and friends gathered in Southern California, each trying to make sense of what had happened. Flyers were printed. Social media was used to share his photograph, young, red-haired, wide-eyed. News outlets began to pick up the story, describing the case as unusual, baffling, and deeply frustrating for all involved. Those who knew Bryce struggled to reconcile the details with the person they remembered. He hadn't seemed like someone preparing to disappear. He had seemed unsettled, yes, but not unwell in a way that would suggest he'd harm himself. He had told his parents he was coming home. He had spoken those words more than once. In the first week following his disappearance, hope remained. There was a chance, some believed, that he had walked away and simply hadn't been found yet. That maybe he had been disoriented, confused after the crash. Maybe he had fallen somewhere nearby, unconscious and still waiting. Or maybe he had chosen to leave his life behind for reasons only he could understand. But even those holding on to that hope had to admit, if that were true, it was strange that he hadn't called, that he hadn't used his phone, that his debit card had remained untouched. Everything pointed to a young man who had vanished, not in a moment of panic or chaos, but in silence. A disappearance that had left behind no signs, no witnesses, and no clear reason why. And in that silence, the questions began to multiply. The weeks that followed Bryce's disappearance unfolded in two parallel timelines. On one side was the official investigation, methodical, procedural, led by trained professionals attempting to build a case from the thin pieces left behind. On the other was the life of his family, friends, and volunteers, filled with long hours of waiting, wandering, and wondering, trying to hold on to the idea that somewhere, somehow, Bryce might still be alive. Castaic Lake remained the focus of the search. The hills around it had been picked over, the water scanned with sonar, and the shoreline walked repeatedly, inch by inch. Dive teams were sent into the deeper pockets of the lake, though visibility was poor and currents unpredictable. Boats crisscrossed the reservoir again and again, searching not only for a body, but for any item that could have drifted: a shoe, a shirt, a sign. Yet no trace surfaced. The Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department worked closely with search and rescue crews, organizing their efforts through grids and maps. Areas were marked off, cleared, and double-checked. Cadaver dogs were deployed, trained to detect human scent even after exposure to heat and time. But day after day, the reports came back the same. Nothing found. For Bryce's parents, Karen and Michael, the waiting was suffocating. They stayed near the lake, trying to be as close as possible to the last place their son had been. They gave interviews, answered questions, and rechecked details over and over. His last phone call, the condition of the vehicle, the statements from the roadside assistance worker who had spoken with Bryce the day before the crash. They looked for meaning in everything. They searched for patterns in conversations, signs in what had seemed ordinary at the time. The questions they asked were the same ones investigators were trying to answer. Had Bryce suffered a head injury in the crash and wandered away in confusion? Had he intentionally staged his disappearance? Had someone encountered him after he left the car? The possibilities were many, but the facts were few. Detectives considered his phone records, banking activity, and social media presence. His cell phone had last pinged near the crash site at around 4:29 a.m. That meant it was powered on for at least 2 hours after the time he told his mother he would stop and rest. But after that, nothing. No further activity. No texts. No calls. His bank account remained untouched. His social media accounts went silent. If Bryce had decided to run away, to start over somewhere far from the life he had known, it seemed unlikely he would have left behind all the tools that would allow him to do so. He had no wallet, no cash, no credit card, no identification. If he had planned to disappear, it had been without the basic resources one would need to sustain it. Unless, of course, that had been the point. Then came the reports, sightings or possible sightings. People claimed they had seen someone matching Bryce's description in nearby towns. One man reported seeing a red-haired young man walking alone along a roadside not far from Castaic. Another said they believed they saw him at a gas station 2 counties over. Each time, investigators followed up. Each time, the leads went nowhere. The descriptions were vague, the locations difficult to confirm. The further the timeline stretched, the harder it became to say what was real and what was hope. For the Laspisa family, it was a delicate balance, staying grounded while keeping the door open for possibilities. They worked with private search teams. They continued to distribute flyers. They kept Bryce's image present in the media, not through dramatics, but with quiet persistence. Their son's face, freckled, red-haired young, became familiar across California. But even familiarity couldn't conjure answers from the silence. Investigators considered whether Bryce might have suffered a psychological break. The changes in his behavior in the days before his disappearance, giving away belongings, ending his relationship abruptly, withdrawing from friends, suggested something had shifted internally. Whether it had been chemical, emotional, or both, they couldn't be sure. But without a diagnosis, without a record of treatment or evaluation, there was no way to say with certainty. He had not threatened self-harm. He had not left behind any note or message to suggest he was saying goodbye. To the contrary, he had told his parents he was coming home. Repeatedly, he had spoken with calmness, not desperation. And the crash itself, while severe, was survivable. Investigators speculated whether he had been trying to hurt himself or whether it had been staged, a means of creating distance without finality. But the evidence remained limited. There was no second car, no third party seen near the scene, no traceable movement afterward. The searches grew further apart. The volunteers became fewer. News stations moved on to other stories. The initial energy that had surrounded the case began to settle into a dull ache, still present, but no longer at the surface. Karen and Michael refused to give up. But they also came to understand what so many families of the missing must learn in time: that not all searches end with discovery, and not all answers arrive quickly. They marked each passing milestone quietly: birthdays, anniversaries, holidays. They did interviews when asked, stayed in touch with detectives, and responded to new information as it came. They stayed hopeful without making promises to themselves they couldn't keep. In the absence of new evidence, the case remained open but still. Nothing in Bryce's digital life had changed. No phone had been turned on, no bank account accessed, no travel record filed. He had vanished not into a crowd or a far-off place, but into the narrow space between familiarity and uncertainty, walking away from a wreck that should have brought him home, but never did. And the land around Castaic Lake, despite being searched again and again, held its silence. In the months after Bryce Laspisa vanished, the rhythm of the search slowed. The early rush of activity, search teams combing hillsides, helicopters circling the lake, media outlets running his photo, gave way to quieter, more uncertain days. There were no discoveries, no new information. The investigation was no less open, but it was becoming something else: still, heavy, and unresolved. For Bryce's family, this shift was more than a change in tempo. It was a change in reality. At first, there had been motion, calls to make, places to search, people to speak with. But when no trace of Bryce appeared, and the leads ran thin, the days grew longer and less structured. The sense of waiting took over, filling the hours with a kind of invisible weight that never fully lifted. Detectives continued their work. Bryce's case remained classified as a missing person, not a criminal investigation, because there was still no evidence of foul play. And yet, no one could say for certain what had happened. He had not run off with money. He had not contacted friends in secret. He had not used social media, or withdrawn cash, or asked for help under a different name. If he had wanted to start a new life, he had done so without taking anything to begin it. That silence, more than anything, was what haunted those closest to him, because there had been nothing conclusive. No body, no witnesses, no answers, only absence. In that kind of space, people begin to imagine, not out of fantasy, but out of a need to hold on to some shape of possibility. There were theories. Some believed Bryce had suffered a psychological break, something that might explain the erratic behavior in the days before his disappearance. Perhaps the drive into the lake area had been purposeful, but confused. Perhaps he had walked off, disoriented, and collapsed somewhere beyond reach. Others speculated that the crash had been a staging, an effort to fake his death and disappear. That perhaps Bryce had planned this, even subtly, and was now living under another identity. But for that to be true, he would have needed help, and he would have needed resources, neither of which showed up in any part of the investigation. Some, quietly, believed that he had taken his life, that the crash may have been an attempt, or that afterward, he had found another way. But if so, there should have been something: evidence in the water, a body recovered from the lake, a note, a sign. There was none. Karen and Michael held space for all of these thoughts. They didn't settle on one. They didn't choose a narrative. They kept the door open, not just emotionally, but practically. They followed every lead that came in, every possible sighting, every stranger who claimed they'd seen someone who looked like Bryce. Some of those tips came from other parts of California, some from other states. Each time they responded, sometimes with hope, sometimes with caution, and each time the result was the same. It wasn't Bryce. What became clear was that the case had joined the quiet category of unresolved disappearances where the evidence offers no clear path forward. The kind of case where the known details become fixed in time, while everything beyond that moment is built on uncertainty. In Bryce's case, the knowns remained simple but solid. He was 19. He had driven hundreds of miles after showing signs of distress. He had told his parents he was coming home. His car was found wrecked, but not destroyed. He was not inside. His belongings were. The terrain had been searched, the timeline reviewed, and nothing else had followed. As the case moved into its second year, it was technically still active. Detectives revisited the files. They re-examined early reports. They followed new suggestions, however small, but no breakthrough arrived. And over time, the nature of the investigation changed. It was no longer about the next urgent step. It was about preserving what they had, in case someday something new surfaced. For Karen and Michael, the years began to stretch. They stayed in touch with the sheriff's department. They worked with non-profit organizations that help families of the missing. They kept a Facebook page updated, not with dramatic claims, but with careful, respectful posts. Reminders of Bryce's face, his story, and the fact that he was still gone. They were cautious with their words in interviews. They didn't jump to conclusions. They didn't lean into theories that would only bring more pain. They kept the conversation steady, honest, and clear. Their message never changed. Bryce is missing, and we are still looking. Friends and classmates marked the time differently. Some stayed involved. Others stepped back. The people who had once known Bryce in school or at college had their own lives to move forward with, and though many still remembered him, the shape of that memory changed. He became a photograph, a shared story, a chapter that had closed without resolution. And in the town of Castaic, the crash site eventually faded back into the landscape. There were no permanent markers. The hillside grew back. The space no longer drew visitors as it had in the first year. But for those who had walked its slopes, who had searched for signs in the rocks and dust, it remained something else. A place that had asked a question and never offered an answer. The search for Bryce did not end, even as time passed. It changed form. It became a quiet, sustained effort, less visible but no less determined. His family still waited, still hoped, still lived in the in-between where days passed, but the story remained exactly where it had stopped. Just before dawn on a road near the lake, in a car that was no longer moving, with a life that had stepped out and disappeared. As the years continued to pass, the disappearance of Bryce Laspisa shifted from being an open question into something more fixed. A story that people remembered not for its resolution, but for its lack of one. In the world of missing persons cases, his name became a kind of reference point. A case people returned to when they spoke about disappearances that defied logic. A story that lingered precisely because it had never been solved. By 2015, 2 full years had gone by. Bryce's name had appeared on national missing persons registries. His case had been profiled by local and national media, picked up by podcasts, discussed in online forums, and revisited in anniversary coverage each August. He had become known in the way that only the missing sometimes are, his face familiar, but his fate completely unknown. The investigation remained open, but it had grown quiet. There were no new sightings that could be confirmed, and no further evidence found near Castaic Lake or beyond. The Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department kept his file active, but without new information, there were few developments to report. They would still follow up on any tip. They still returned calls from his parents. But the energy that had once fueled daily searches had become something softer and slower, a waiting that had no timeline. In Laguna Niguel, where Karen and Michael lived, Bryce's absence shaped every part of their lives. His room was kept as it had been. His belongings remained untouched. The rituals of ordinary life, the groceries, the errands, the holidays, continued, but under a layer of grief that never lifted entirely. The kind of grief not born from loss, but from uncertainty. It is a difficult kind. The mind runs in circles. What if he's out there? What if he isn't? And if he isn't, how would we ever know? In the years following his disappearance, Karen and Michael became quiet figures of strength in the community of families affected by missing persons cases. They didn't speak in absolutes. They didn't indulge speculation. They remained open to all possibilities, even as the years made some harder to imagine. They believed, still, that their son could be alive. They had no proof he wasn't. And until they did, they chose to believe in the hope that he might one day be found. Bryce's face continued to appear in age progression sketches. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children created images showing what he might look like at 20, then 25. His freckles, his red hair, his eyes. Each year, those images were shared again. On social media, in missing persons databases, in flyers sent out by the family and by volunteers who had taken his case to heart. And people still cared. Even strangers who had never met Bryce followed the case. It wasn't unusual for someone to discover the story and feel immediately drawn in, not by drama, but by the quiet strangeness of it. A car, a phone, a wallet, a boy who said he was coming home, a wrecked vehicle, and nothing else. It stayed with people. Some began to see parallels in other cases. Other young men who had vanished under unusual circumstances, some after nights of strange behavior, others after one wrong turn on a familiar road. These similarities weren't always direct, and they didn't offer explanations. But they added to the sense that Bryce's story was not alone, and that disappearance can sometimes come not from malice, but from confusion, from disorientation, from a moment of internal collapse no one else can see. In online communities, people dissected the timeline again and again. They mapped out the route Bryce had taken. They cataloged each phone call, each stop, each message. They debated what might have happened in those last hours before the crash. Was it an accident? A signal? A final attempt to sever himself from his previous life? There were no answers, only theories. Through it all, his parents remained present. Not always loudly, but consistently. They continued to manage his Facebook page. They responded to messages. They reminded people gently that their son was still missing, and that they had not given up. And the community around them remained loyal. People who had never met Bryce still returned each August to post his picture, to write a message, to say simply that they remembered. The mystery never faded. It only became more familiar, less a puzzle to be solved, and more a story to be carried. Castaic Lake, too, remained unchanged. The area where Bryce's car had been found no longer drew media crews or search parties, but it hadn't been forgotten. Locals who lived nearby knew the story. Some said they thought about him every time they passed the turnoff. Others said they avoided that stretch altogether. The land had become something different. Not haunted, exactly, but heavy, weighted with memory. Every now and then, someone would claim to have seen someone who looked like Bryce. A man at a shelter, a traveler passing through, a hitchhiker near the Nevada border. These tips were followed up as they came in. None led anywhere, but each time Karen and Michael listened, because if there was any chance, no matter how small, they were willing to hear it out. In the years that followed, what became most evident was how the case had settled into a permanent in-between. Not closed, not active, just there, constant, quiet, unresolved. And still, the most difficult question remained the one asked from the very beginning. How does a person disappear so completely, in the middle of their own life, without anyone seeing where they went? By the time a decade had passed, the disappearance of Bryce Laspisa no longer felt like a moment frozen in time. It had become part of the emotional landscape of those who remembered him, not just as a mystery, but as a quiet wound that never closed. In Laguna Niguel, where the Laspisa family still lived, Bryce's absence was folded into daily life. The world around them moved forward. Birthdays came and went, the seasons changed, but the question of what happened to their son remained fixed, untouched by time. Karen and Michael had learned to live in this space. They had not stopped searching, but they had stopped expecting resolution to arrive in a single dramatic moment. They knew now that the most likely outcome might come in pieces, if at all. A tip that led somewhere. A discovery made by accident. A moment of clarity from someone who had seen something, but not realized its importance until years later. They had long accepted that waiting was not passive. It was its own kind of effort. It meant continuing to speak, when asked. Continuing to answer the same questions, over and over. Continuing to represent their son's story without embellishment or assumption. And most of all, continuing to live without certainty. Every missing person's case is unique, but families who walk this road share something familiar: the burden of silence. Not knowing is a weight. It reshapes the way you think, the way you move through the world. It teaches patience, but not peace. Some days are filled with renewed hope. An article, a post, a new idea that feels just plausible enough to stir something. Other days are quieter. The kind of quiet that asks nothing and offers nothing in return. For the Laspisas, keeping Bryce's memory visible had always been important. But more than that, they wanted him to remain understood as a person. Not a case, not just a face in a flyer. He had been thoughtful, creative, someone who laughed easily and who was liked by those around him. He had once wanted to design things, to build furniture, maybe, or work with his hands. He was someone who had not seemed lost until he was already slipping away. That's what made his disappearance so difficult to understand. There had been signs, changes in behavior, detachment, but none of them had shouted. None of them had warned anyone clearly that something irreversible was about to happen. And even now, the people closest to him couldn't agree on what exactly had gone wrong. Some believed he had experienced a mental health crisis, perhaps subtle, but powerful enough to unmoor him. Others leaned toward the idea of intentional disappearance, that he had wanted to leave, though why, no one could say. The hardest theory was the one many feared most quietly, that something had happened to him after the crash, that he had walked away from the vehicle only to encounter something else, an accident or another person. But without evidence, every possibility lived in the same space, unknown. The land near Castaic Lake, where his car had been found, remained much the same. Dry, wide, unforgiving in places. There were still people who visited that stretch of road, who pulled over quietly to stand at the edge of the ravine. Some left flowers, others simply looked. The place itself had not changed, but what it meant had deepened. It had become a symbol, not just of Bryce's disappearance, but of how little we sometimes know about the people we love, even when they're just a phone call away. There were people, strangers, who still followed the case. Some had been there from the beginning, others had discovered it later, and been drawn in by the quiet strangeness of it. They reached out to the family sometimes, not with promises or theories, but with support. Simple messages. I think of Bryce often. I hope you find peace. I haven't forgotten. In the world of unresolved cases, Bryce's name was often mentioned. His story appeared in books, in blogs, in crime podcasts trying to make sense of the senseless. But the Laspisas were careful about how the story was told. They did not want it twisted into entertainment. They wanted it remembered truthfully, for the details they knew, and for the silence they had to live with. Every few years they were asked again, "What do you believe happened?" And each time, their answer was measured. They didn't claim certainty. They didn't claim closure. What they said was this: we don't know, but we're still here. They still marked Bryce's birthday. They still hoped, not in the cinematic way people often imagine, but in the quiet, steady way that comes from love, from a refusal to accept that someone can disappear completely, with no one ever knowing why. In many ways, that is what remains most haunting about Bryce's case. Not just the lack of answers, but the fact that everything, his last conversations, his drive, his final location, was ordinary. Nothing about it should have led to disappearance. And yet it did. There were no final words. No crisis visible from the outside. Just a young man, 19 years old, telling his parents he would be home soon. And then nothing. As the years continued to slip by, Bryce Laspisa's story took on a shape larger than the sum of its parts. It moved from local headlines into something more enduring, an unresolved case that quietly became part of a national conversation about how people vanish, and why some disappearances seem to leave so few clues behind. Not because no one was looking, but because what they were searching for was never fully visible to begin with. Among those who studied missing persons cases, investigators, analysts, and advocates, Bryce's disappearance became a reference point. It was the kind of case often mentioned at training sessions or panel discussions, not because it held a textbook answer, but because it didn't. The facts were simple. The timeline was clear. There were no signs of foul play, no verified sightings, no digital trail. Just a car, a crash, and a vanishing. What made Bryce's case feel especially disquieting was its contrast to the ordinary life he had been living. He wasn't someone on the run. He hadn't been living off-grid. He hadn't been caught in a criminal investigation or surrounded by danger. He had been a sophomore in college, with a solid relationship with his parents, a group of friends, and a clear plan to return home. And yet, somewhere in the midst of those seemingly stable days, something shifted. That shift, subtle, difficult to define, became one of the most discussed elements of the case. Mental health professionals who followed the story spoke about how young adulthood is often a time of internal change, how pressure, chemical imbalance, or emotional collapse can emerge suddenly. Some wondered whether Bryce had been experiencing the early signs of a breakdown. Others pointed to the signs that had gone unnoticed or unaddressed: sleep disruption, sudden decisions, a growing detachment from those around him. There was no formal diagnosis, no confirmed episode, but the questions around his state of mind invited deeper discussion. What does it mean when someone begins to unravel quietly? What happens when the signs are there, but don't set off alarms? And when someone begins to disappear before they physically vanish, what can be done? His story resonated especially with families who had dealt with their own loved ones going missing. It became a mirror for other unresolved cases. Young adults who had taken sudden turns, left confusing notes, or simply walked away without saying why. For some, Bryce's story validated their own unanswered questions. For others, it opened new ones. In online communities, his name continued to appear, shared again with every new podcast episode, every article re-examining cold cases. The same questions were asked each time. Could he have survived? Could he be living somewhere else under a different name? Did he mean to leave? Or did something prevent him from coming back? Theories persisted. Some remained convinced Bryce had taken his own life, even if no body had been found. Others believed he had chosen to disappear, walking away from the wrecked car into a new chapter no one else was meant to witness. And still others feared that he had encountered someone after the crash, someone with the intent to harm, or perhaps someone who had seen him vulnerable and taken advantage of that moment. But with no new evidence, the theories never moved beyond speculation. And yet people kept looking. Now and then, someone would post a photo of a man in another state who resembled Bryce. A tip would surface, often vague, often quickly ruled out. But for those holding on to any thread of hope, it was something. Even strangers carried his story. People who had never met him, never crossed paths with his family, still found themselves remembering his name. The image of his Toyota Highlander at the bottom of the embankment, the fact that he had promised to come home, the strange stillness of it all. It became a story people told quietly, not for drama, but because it didn't make sense. Within his own community, Bryce's memory was kept alive in small, steady ways. Local organizations included his case in outreach campaigns for mental health awareness and missing persons resources. Search and rescue trainings referenced the thorough, but ultimately unsuccessful, recovery efforts at Castaic Lake. Young people entering college who heard the story were reminded, gently, how important it was to speak up when something doesn't feel right, either in themselves or in someone they know. And for those close to Bryce, the story remained personal. His parents continued to mark each year of his absence. They continued to share his face, not through slogans or headlines, but through care, through consistency, through presence. Because at its heart, Bryce's disappearance had become not just about what had been lost, but about what it meant to keep looking anyway. What it meant to remember someone not for what might have happened, but for who they had been. There was no grand theory left to unfold, no final piece of evidence to unlock the truth. Only a young man whose journey ended at the edge of a lake, a family still waiting, and a community, now much larger than the one that had known him in life, holding space for the possibility that one day, they might understand what happened after he stepped away from the road and into silence. By the 9th year, Bryce's name had found its place, not in the breaking news cycle, but in the quieter corners of collective memory. His disappearance wasn't spoken of loudly anymore. It was carried instead in a softer way, among strangers who had followed the story from the beginning, among families living with similar silence, among the investigators who still kept his file open on a shelf, even if they hadn't touched it in months. What remained wasn't urgency. It was weight, the weight of not knowing, and the quiet commitment to never fully look away. Each August, Around the anniversary of his disappearance, his parents would share a post online. Always calm, always measured, a message not meant to reopen pain, but to remind people that he was still missing, that their son's story didn't have an ending, that they were still here and still waiting. The responses came steadily. Notes from old friends, comments from strangers who remembered, messages from people who had lost someone too and now followed the Laspisa family, not just out of sympathy, but solidarity. The years hadn't changed the facts. No new evidence had emerged, but the shape of the grief had settled into something deeper, less raw, but more permanent. For Karen and Michael, the hardest part had never been the theories or the lack of movement. It was the quiet in between, the day-to-day rhythm of life continuing while the questions stayed unanswered. His shoes were still there. His room still held his things. And the front door had never been locked against the chance, however faint, that he might one day walk through it again. Across communities, Bryce's story had found an unusual longevity. People remembered not because there had been new developments, but because the nature of the case resisted forgetting. A college student, a quiet night, a long drive, a wrecked car, and then a complete disappearance. It was a kind of vanishing that felt impossible, and yet it had happened. In some cities, his story had become part of workshops or training sessions held for law enforcement or community responders. The case was used as an example, not of failure, but of complexity. It asked uncomfortable questions. What do we miss when a person is slipping away but hasn't yet vanished? How do we recognize a crisis when it doesn't come with flashing lights? What does it mean when a case leaves no evidence, and yet clearly isn't finished? Bryce's disappearance had shown how quickly things can change, even when everything appears ordinary. That a person can speak calmly on the phone, promise to be home soon, and still never arrive. It reminded people, professionals and families alike, that disappearance can begin long before someone is officially missing, and that sometimes the signs are only visible in hindsight. The search efforts had long since gone quiet, but the story was still passed on. True crime podcasts revisited it. Online communities continued to circulate flyers. People would discover the story for the first time and feel the same ache others had felt nearly a decade earlier. That moment when they realized he was right there. And then he wasn't. In Castaic, the area near the crash site hadn't changed much. Nature had reclaimed parts of the terrain. The embankment had faded back into the dry hillsides. But for some, it was still a place of reflection. Not just because it marked the last known location, but because of what it represented. A point in time where the known stopped, and everything after became a question. For Karen and Michael, it remained sacred in a quiet, complicated way. It wasn't where they had found their son, but it was the closest thing to a place that connected them to him. Not a grave, not a home, but a space where something ended or began, and where the silence still felt personal. Other families had since reached out to them, some facing new disappearances, others living with long-standing uncertainty. They asked how to cope, how to live in the waiting, and the Laspisas never claimed to have the answers. What they shared was presence, the kind of presence that said, "We are still here. You can be too." In doing so, they gave Bryce's story another shape, one not only defined by the unknown, but by how it continued to echo. Through the lives it touched, through the conversations it started, through the recognition that even without closure, remembrance matters. And so his name continued to be spoken, not loudly, not always in public, but in homes, in quiet thoughts, in the steady rhythm of a search that had never truly stopped. In the quiet stretch of time that follows a disappearance, when the first searches have ended and the urgency fades, what often remains is not clarity, but presence. A kind of stillness that settles into the lives of those left behind. Not an answer, not even a direction, just the shape of someone missing and the long, ongoing act of remembering them without knowing where they are. For the Laspisa family, this became the world they learned to live in. 10 years is a long time, a lifetime for some, for others a blink. But for families of the missing, it's something else entirely. A span that stretches out without change, without update, without relief. Each year, Bryce's parents found themselves facing the same dates. The day he left, the day he called, the day the car was found, the day the silence began. And yet they never stopped speaking his name, not because they expected to find him in the next moment, but because memory had become its own kind of presence. They spoke of him softly, steadily. They didn't retreat from the world, nor did they pretend everything was normal. They lived with what was unresolved in a way that didn't demand resolution. Hope had changed, too. It wasn't loud. It didn't carry the kind of emotional charge people often assume. It was quieter, a choice made over and over again, to remain open to the possibility that the story wasn't over, to believe that something could shift, even if it hadn't yet, and if it never did, to keep carrying the story anyway. Others helped carry it, too. Some were friends. Some were strangers. People who checked in once a year. People who still shared Bryce's flyer, even after so much time had passed. People who had followed his case and chosen not to forget. These gestures weren't big. They weren't meant to solve the case. But they mattered, because when someone disappears, what they leave behind is not just the absence of their body, but the echo of who they were. Their habits, their laughter, their place in the lives of others, their seat at the table still empty, their voice in a voicemail still saved, their favorite song, the way they once answered the phone. Karen and Michael never tried to define Bryce's story for anyone else. They didn't say they knew what had happened. They didn't push for theories. They didn't pretend to understand what had led to that moment near Castaic Lake. But they continued to live their lives in a way that honored his, not only by waiting, but by remembering. And in doing so, they offered a kind of quiet permission to others to hold space for the unknown, even when it offers nothing back. The community that had formed around Bryce's story, readers, listeners, advocates, also began to understand that his disappearance was not a problem to be solved, but a truth to be carried. It spoke to something larger: how we treat those who vanish, how we talk about them, how we care for the people they leave behind. It showed that not all stories end. Some simply continue, year after year, not with new chapters, but with continued attention, continued care. In the midst of this, life went on, but the memory remained. At the edge of Castaic Lake, where Bryce's car was once found, the land is still. People pass by, some unaware of what once happened there. Others stop for a moment, knowing, not to search anymore, but to be present. Because sometimes the only thing we can offer in the absence of resolution is presence. And presence is powerful. In his absence, Bryce became more than just a case number. He became part of how others understand loss. Part of how others think about silence and hope and grief that never hardens into finality. And through it all, his parents remained. Still here, still waiting, still remembering the boy who told them he'd be home soon, and never was. Time has passed. 10 years. More than a decade since a red-haired 19-year-old set out on a drive from Northern California to his parents' home in the South and never arrived. More than a decade since a quiet phone call in the early hours of the morning, his voice calm, tired, marked the last time anyone heard from him. No new evidence has surfaced. No remains have been found. His bank account has stayed untouched. His name still appears in missing persons databases. And his story, though aged by the years, has not faded. In the quiet space Bryce left behind, those who knew him, or came to know him after he vanished, have kept going. Not forward in the usual sense, but onward, alongside the uncertainty. His parents still live with it every day. And so do the others. Friends who remember his laugh. Strangers who found meaning in his case. People who see something familiar in his face, his silence, his absence. In Laguna Niguel, life moved around the shape Bryce once filled. His room remained. His voice lived on in memory. Some days were harder than others. Some were made heavier by hope. Others softened by the familiarity of the ache. His parents never called his case closed, because it wasn't. They had no answers to wrap around their grief, no evidence to rewrite what had been lost. But they had their son's story, and they continued to tell it, not loudly, not to demand, but simply so it would not be forgotten. There are stories that end, and there are stories that stay open, not for lack of effort, but because the final pages were never written. Bryce's is one of those. A case that lives not in conclusion, but in quiet remembrance. In the questions it raised. In the silence it left behind. In the ways it taught others to look more closely, to listen more carefully, to take seriously the signs that something may be shifting inside someone you care about. His story did not disappear with him. It became part of something larger, about mental health, about missing persons, about how even ordinary-seeming days can slip unexpectedly into mystery. Bryce is remembered not just for the unknown that surrounds his disappearance, but for the life he lived before it. For the photos left behind, the laughter shared with friends, the designs he made, the plans he talked about, the family who still carries him. The world didn't stop when Bryce went missing. But for those who knew him, it changed. And in a quiet house not far from the ocean, a door remains unlocked. A room remains undisturbed. A pair of parents still live their days with the same steady love. Still hoping, still remembering, still here. Because not every story ends. Some are carried,